Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to get started because we're starting a couple minutes late because we were delayed in our first session. So I'm going to jump right in and introduce our great speakers this morning. Oh, I'm just having some technical issues. Ooh. Okay. So if you were in our first session this morning, you would have already met Professor Helen Roy. She will be joining us on the panel again this morning. Helen is an ecologist at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. Her research focuses, sorry, I keep backing. My screen share is not working anymore, I don't think, so I'm having some issues here. Her research focuses on the effects of environmental change on insects. Oh my, I just have pop-ups coming up everywhere right now. I'm so sorry. Too many screens open. I'm just gonna stop sharing so you can just hear my voice. If it will let me. Sorry, everyone, bear with me for a moment. Okay, now I can continue. Okay, so Helen's research focuses on the effects of environmental change on insects and other species. She has worked extensively within the field of invasion biology. Her research on invasive non-native species has received international recognition, and she is leading a global assessment on invasive non-native species for the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Anthony Ricciardi. Anthony Ricciardi is a professor of biology at McGill University, a McGill Trache Fellow in Science and Public Policy, and for 30 years, Tony's research has examined the impacts and spread of invasive freshwater fishes and invertebrates. From 2006 to 2016, he served on the scientific committee of the Canadian Aquatic Invasive Species Network, which assessed the risks and mechanisms of biological invasions in our lakes, rivers, and coastal waters. So welcome, Anthony. Dr. Pedro Antunes is a professor in the Department of Biology at Algoma University in Sault Ste. Marie. He has a Bachelor of Science in Biology and a PhD in soil science with a focus on plant microbe interactions. For the past 10 years, his research has primarily looked at how interactions between invasive plants and soil organisms affect the diversity of soil organisms and plants in communities. Dr. Antunes was appointed Canada Research Chair in Invasive Species Biology in 2015, an award he had renewed in 2020 for another 5-year term. And finally, I'd like to introduce Dr. Stephen Cooke. He is a professor of environmental and interdisciplinary science at Carleton University. His interests span the natural and social sciences with a focus on solving complex conservation problems. Cooke is the secretary of the College of the Royal Society of Canada and editor-in-chief of the journal Conservation Physiology. And you can learn more about his team's activities at www.fecpl.ca. So with that, we can jump into our first few questions. This is a panel discussion, so I have a few questions for the group, and then feel free at any time to add your questions into the question box. So my first question, hopefully a bit of an icebreaker for everyone. What is your least favorite invasive species? Stephen, you can start us off and we'll just go around the table here.
I guess putting on my hat as chair of the Sea Lamprey Research Board, it's going to have to be sea lamprey. It doesn't just affect one species, it affects the entire Great Lakes ecosystem. There's a lot of effort put forth right now to try and recover native fish species, and this is a beast that we have to throw a lot of money at. There's many careers, and although I love those folks, I'd like to think there's a day in the future where those careers would become irrelevant, but I don't think that's going to be the case. This is a long-term battle, and quite an insidious beast, given that it's a parasite, even how it feeds. So I think that would be my least favorite, yet at the same time, you know, there's some respect there. It would be the lamprey.
Thanks, Stephen. Tony, do you want to go ahead?
I'll tell you about my favorite.
Sure.
It's a duo, as their congeners, the zebra and the quagga mussel. The quagga mussel has basically supplanted the zebra mussel as the dominant mussel in the Great Lakes. I don't think there has been another species that has changed the rules of existence for everything else in the Great Lakes than the zebra/quagga mussel. One followed the other, and the quagga mussel has now basically further altered the system, and it affects fisheries, it affects biodiversity, it affects the health of terrestrial birds, it affects contaminant cycling, it affects nutrient cycling. Every basic ecosystem process that you could think of has been affected by the zebra/quagga mussels. And so I don't consider them a least favorite. I have, as Steve noted for lamprey, I have a grudging admiration for them, and they are excellent model organisms to understand how a single species or a couple of species can completely change the game for everything else.
Great, thanks, Tony. Helen, do you want to talk about your favorite or least favorite invasive species?
Yes, so I think in terms of on the work that I described from the UK overseas territories and making the predictions around what could be arriving and posing a threat within the next 10 years, it's ants that when I hear about them, and I have huge admiration for them. I am fascinated by ants. They're incredible, but a little bit like the mussels, for instance, they are what we call ecosystem engineers, and they are capable of really quite dramatic changes to the places in which they arrive. And they are great at arriving in places. They can hop on to containers and travel around the world. And it's fascinating to think about the ways in which they are moving around the world and their networks of doing that. But yeah, in particular, this little fire ant that I mentioned in my talk is quite an impressive beast. Tiny, but impressive.
For sure. Pedro, you're up. Oh, Pedro, I think your audio is breaking up a little bit. I'm still not hearing you super clearly. Is everybody else hearing that also, or is it just me?
I can't hear, no.
Pedro, you can try going into the audio settings in your GoToWebinar dashboard. No.
How about now? Is it better?
Much better,
okay.
yeah.
All right. I don't know. Sorry about that. My system is maybe too complex. It never happened before, but there's the Murphy's law there. Okay, so I was saying that I don't have a particular invader as least favorite because, you know, invasive species are a global change problem, and we humans are the creators of vectors and pathways. So we are, I think, a lot often the species that probably needs most change. But because I had to choose a species, I did choose Carpobrutus edulis. This is a creeping mat-forming succulent plant that I very often see on the shores when I go to the beach in my home country of Portugal. And those, you know, every time I look at it and how invasive this species is, and I look at all these acres and acres of land, and I know that that's not a very large portion of land because it's just in that area close to the ocean where you have sand dunes, and we also know that there's a lot of native species, and a lot of them are endemic species. And so, you know, that's a laboratory of evolution and biodiversity. And now it's pretty much colonized by this one invader. So it makes me always, every time when I go through there, as I was preparing for this talk, I think about, that's it's so dramatic to see the impact of invasive plants, and that's the one spot. And I think about evolutionary implications and current biodiversity implications.
Thank you, everyone. I thought that was a good kind of icebreaker question for the conversation today, so thank you. So now I think through the rest of the questions, a few of them maybe we can go through around the table as we just did, but moving on from that, I think if you have an answer, you can just chime in as you wish, and we'll have just a nice informal conversation. So does anybody want to discuss what encouraged you to start working in the field of invasive species?
I'm happy to begin because it was an invasive alien species that got me involved with invasive alien species, and that I'm a community ecologist, so I'm fascinated by the interactions amongst species and also with their environment. And I have a particular passion for ladybirds and run a citizen science project back in the UK on ladybirds. And when the Harlequin Ladybird arrived in 2004, it's a species that is native to Asia, had been used around the world as a biological control agent, and unsurprisingly arrived in England, even though it wasn't intentionally introduced. And that ladybird threw me into the world of invasion biology. And yeah, it went from there.
Thanks, Helen. Anybody else want to share their experience?
What driven me to study invasive species, it's a global change problem. So it matters to everyone on the planet, and one of the things that I've always fascinated by is, and all ecologists are, is like, why are some plants or some species plants, because I work a lot with plants, so why are they more abundant, some more abundant than others, right? So why do we find certain species in a given environment and not others? And this is fascinating to think about an invasive species, because they are relatively new arrivals. Then, I thought this is both a problem, but also an opportunity to see novel biotic interactions. So you see this, how species interactions unfold, and how that ultimately contributes to shaping landscapes. Over here in Northern Ontario, we have these beautiful boreal landscapes and mixed deciduous. We have so many different types of, and I look at them, and why do they look the way? Why are these species here? And now, now we can use invasive plants to try to as an opportunity to also to study them, and at the same time create awareness, because these landscapes are facing an important threat from climate change, invasive species, and others.
For sure. Thanks, Pedro. Stephen or Tony, do you want to jump in? No.
I've told people this before. My interest was derived from the fact that I was always interested in the St. Lawrence River, having grown up along it. And one day, when I was a student a long time ago, June 1991, I found the zebra mussel. Didn't recognize it right away. It took me a while. There were only a few of them. And that was the first time I think the mussel was recorded in the river. It was my first encounter with a species that was destined to become one of the most ecologically disruptive invaders ever seen in North America. And a few years later, it became the focus of my PhD thesis. So I knew as an undergraduate what my PhD thesis was going to be. I just had to go through the normal track to get there. And that introduced me to the literature of what was at the time a rapidly expanding field. And as Pedro noted, and it's still not widely appreciated, that it's not about a mussel here or a fish that's ectoparasitic there or a plant here. These are all symptomatic of a form of global change that challenges our ability to manage ecosystems.
That's great. Thanks, Tony. So the next question will start digging us into the kind of the meat and potatoes of the forum here, or for the discussion here. What do you believe is the greatest challenge in preparing for and actively managing invasive species? Yeah, go ahead, Stephen.
Hey, so I think for a long time we felt that there's science needs that impede action, but I think more and more those science needs aren't necessarily going to be the conventional ones, you know, the natural sciences, if you wish. I think people are going to increasingly be a big part of this, and we're going to need to lean on the social sciences. It's about human behavior in terms of trying to prevent these invasions in the first place. We know that after invasions occur, we're generally pretty poor at being able to get rid of them. At best, we can try and control them or suppress them. And that also depends on people. That depends on good behaviors. And so I think there's a lot of room for research and scholarship around understanding the basis for human decisions and how we can nudge people to do the right thing. I think this also connects to ensuring that we've got the social license to continue to engage in our control efforts, some of which are on the surface rather egregious, you know, using rotenone as a whole lake pesticide to wipe out smallmouth bass in Nova Scotia, or some of the approaches that are used to control sea lamprey in the Great Lakes. Now, you know, this is done for benefit for the broader ecosystem, but nonetheless, there are localized impacts, and people are starting to question those. And I think we need to work to understand how much of a license we really do have and what we can do to bolster that, so that we've got the kind of support moving forward. But it goes back to that original thing. If we can prevent invasions in the first place, and there's a lot of human dimension questions around that, a lot of opportunity for action and behavioral change.
Absolutely. I agree with you, Stephen. I think that social part is key. Does anybody else have anything to add about challenges?
Yeah, I completely agree with Steve. I think that the social people need to get involved, but I think that governments or not-for-profits, other organizations, they play a role, a very important role in getting that information across, but in a very pointed, strategic way. And so I'm going to point two things. So one of the biggest challenges is going to be always the lack of interest that results from the success that the institutions have. So you are, in a way, a victim of your own success, because if you do a very good job at eradicating a species or controlling a species, then there's less potential interest from political agencies and interest in funding that. The other thing, the other dimension of this is coordination is so important, and in how these not-for-profits or other CFIA, other stakeholders, they utilize the new databases. We will talk about them later. The databases that are available, the trait databases that exist today, to pinpoint what can be the future invaders, so that we can have to, for example, the public knows already ahead of time. They have a visual picture of these are the potential invaders that we'll be looking for, and ahead of time they're already searching for that. There's some good examples of aquatic invaders, I think, in California, where you had the public already, the divers already looking, monitoring for particular invaders that were not even yet there, because they received that information from. So the coordination, having centralized coordination, I think it's is very important, and a main center that people can contact as well.
Thank you, Pedro. Helen or Tony, anything to add? Or I think Stephen and Pedro captured it pretty well.
Go ahead, Ellen.
No, I was thinking they have captured it really well. I think, yeah, communication and collaboration is absolutely critical.
I would add, if you're asking what the greatest challenge is, in my mind, it's increasing invasion rates. In the systems I'm interested in, large urbanized aquatic ecosystems, non-native species of plants, invertebrates, fishes are being discovered at a greater frequency over years and decades than ever before. Worldwide, this invasion event, this mass invasion event, has no precedent. There's nothing in the fossil record I could point to that, unlike extinctions, for example, that's not much consolation, but I can point to 5 big mass. I can point to nothing in the fossil record that amounts to, even though species have always been moving around, that amounts to what's happening now, as Helen showed with Anu Siebens' data. But on a smaller scale, aquatic systems, usually the rate of accumulation of species is nonlinear, exponential in many cases. So managers have to contend with continuous disruptions, many small, some large, some that are small now that can become large later, and so on. And the more species that you have becoming established, the greater chance that at least one of them will become disruptive. So basically, they're like a tax, in the sense that, like any real tax, they don't go away once they're established. They only increase in cost. And so if we look at them from an economic point of view as a tax on the system, then you might be able to understand why prevention is the key. So increasing invasion rates, burgeoning rates of invasion remain, in my mind, the greatest challenge. There's lots associated with that, synergies with other stressors and so on, but that's, you have to have the flood first before all this other myriad impact will occur. And we have to find a way to slow down the flood.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tony. I had one question come in from the audience, so I'm going to address that. It's for Helen. I'm guessing this came from your talk. They're asking about challenges when performing horizon scans for invasive species. So while we're on challenges, I thought I would throw this in now as well.
Yeah, well, I think the challenge relates to what Tony was just saying in a way, this increasing number of new records around the world, and some of the species for which they don't have a previous invasion history. How do we begin to even imagine what that group of species are going to be? And there are approaches to doing that, but also in terms of our sort of levels of expertise. When we bring big groups together, I always find it remarkable how we do manage to fill in lots of gaps and challenge ourselves to sort of step outside our own comfort areas of particular taxonomic expertise or environmental expertise to fill those gaps well. But for example, we tried to do horizon scanning around pathogens a few years ago, and we published in 2017 a paper from it that was, why could we not do that? Why could we not think about alien pathogens in the same horizon scanning way? And the gaps are just so vast. And even our understanding of the sort of entities that these things are. And of course, now here we are in a global pandemic, and the parasites and pathogens that are coming along with these invasive alien species are something that is also going to be a challenge for us to understand and to really begin to make some predictions so that we can be better prepared going forward.
Absolutely. Thanks, Helen. So our next question, does anybody have any lessons learned from past invaders that you think should be considered when preparing for future invaders? Anybody want to take a stab?
There are many. Okay. First of all, we've learned that the timing of invasions is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to predict in most cases, because it involves an alignment of windows of opportunity. Even if you know that something might be coming because of a transportation mechanism that connects your target region of interest to a donor region that has something that thrives in the same kind of environment as your target system, you don't know when it's going to show up. You don't know how many times it will take before, how many introductions it'll take before it'll show up. It's like striking a match or trying to start a forest fire. It can happen. It could happen on the first drop of a match, but it may happen like 10 matches later. So timing is difficult. It's one of the most difficult things in risk assessment. Relative occurrence might be a little bit easier, like this will come in first before that, but timing of when is another story. And there are other ones, like we learned over and over again, no matter whether it's a mussel or a plant or whatever, opportunity, propagular pressure, that is the introduction pressure, and context dependence, the arena in which the game is being played. These govern invasion risk, and some of them are difficult to model. Other ones not so difficult. So these are some of the common things. There's more, but I'll let the other panelists describe them. We've learned a lot from these disparate cases.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tony. Anybody else want to jump in? Stephen, go ahead.
I think I think something else we've learned is our failure to learn. And so I'm going to use the example of after they're here and we start to throw everything at an invasive species in an attempt to suppress or eradicate. And we've done a really poor job of capturing that science and those attempts and sharing them such that we go out and then repeat those mistakes. We repeat what didn't work over and over again. And so, and I get it, oftentimes those initial control efforts are done by frontline practitioners that don't have any incentive to, publish those accounts. But we need to ensure that when we do those kinds of rapid interventions, they're oftentimes very rapid, that we do it in a way where we still have controls to the best of our ability, and we treat them as experiments. We learn from it and we share it. Without that, it's a lost opportunity for improving how to deal with that species elsewhere or in the future. And we devote a lot of resources, waste a lot of resources to trying the same thing that's failed elsewhere. We just don't know it's failed elsewhere. So it's the need to learn and share, and fora like this are great for doing that. But there's increasingly opportunities for frontline practitioners who don't publish a lot to write up small, case study briefs. There's new journals like Ecological Solutions and Evidence that specifically has case studies from frontline practitioners. It doesn't have to be well referenced. It's just, here's what we did and here's what we learned. That's incredibly valuable, and we need to harvest that information so we can use it.
Absolutely. Thanks, Stephen. Helen, go ahead.
I think that we have also learned of the ways in which people were getting involved in inspiring ways. So through, for example, surveillance for invasive non-native species, for example, with the Harlequin Ladybird survey, which we established in 2004, it went beyond my imagination in terms of people's involvement, and also projects spinning off from that as well that were led and run by people who were just interested in the area. And I think that then being able to build on that success with other surveillance systems, I think that is something that we have learned, that people are engaged with this and they do want to make a difference. And through all the things we've already been saying through this panel this afternoon around collaborations, communication and sharing of information as widely as we possibly can, we really have some hope to be able to address the problems that we're also describing.
Thanks, Helen. Pedro, do you want to add anything before we move on to the next question?
Just quickly, I think we have to have always present in our heads the invasive species curve and where we are at there in relation to in knowing that yes, prevention is really important. Also later on though, because we can put more resources into prevention if we can, and I mentioned earlier the aspect of coordination. If a conservation authority, for example, needs to make decisions about herbicide applications for controlling an invasive plant, but in another year or two, there's already things going on to develop biological control agents, but there's just not awareness of that, then that's why we need decentralized. I very much believe that we need a centralized one-stop shop where everybody could get this access to these kinds of information. The other thing that I just wanted to point out is that from what we've learned from past invasions, for example, if I think about emerald ash borer, our urban environments, they need to be managed differently. We need to manage in urban settings our invasive species differently. We can't have monocultures of ash, for example, that will have all to be replaced. And I think they're thinking about biodiversity, diverse communities will make these systems more resilient as well. Resistant and then resilient. Hopefully not resilient. Will make them more resistant is way more important. And so yeah, we learned that from EAB. I think we need to change the way we look at our urban forests and our urban streets and all of that.
Sure. Okay, thanks, Pedro. This is an audience question coming in Based on your knowledge of public policy and the difficulty in the ability for governments to react to new species invasions in an appropriate timeline, do you have any advice on how governments can be better prepared to respond? Go ahead, Stephen.
So one of the challenges is that we have sort of multi-scalar governance in Canada. So it's not one organization, one entity that's ever responsible. You know, we might have a water body, and so it was a federal issue when it kind of came through the door, but it ended up in, you know, a pond in Ontario. So all of a sudden the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry has a role, but it's on, you know, in a natural area run by the, you know, the Rideau Valley Conservation Authority. And so sort of where does the buck stop, and who's got money to spend, and whose responsibility is it? So that's one of the things that I think we still sort of lack in Canada. You know, and you could sit back and muse about, do we need something kind of like the Public Health Agency of Canada or the forthcoming Canada Water Agency that's focused on invasive species and nothing but, trying to A, keep them out, B, deal with them when they're here. I'm not one for more bureaucracy, but invasive species are certainly an interesting group of organisms that have, you know, they continue to slip through the cracks because there are so many players involved, and it's easy to pass the buck.
For sure, great point, Stephen. Thank you. Does anybody else have anything to add to that?
I mean, I don't mind adding as well that, you know, I think organizations such as your Invasive Species Center and in GB, the Non-Native Species Secretariat, they just play such a crucial role in terms of that coordination. And, you know, it is really complex when a species arrives, and whose jurisdiction is it under. And I think that, you know, having that coordination is really important. And, you know, we've really seen the benefits of that. We have a kind of chief invasion scientist here in Britain, in the same way as we have a chief medical officer. And, you know, that's really important.
Thanks, Helen. Sorry, I'm just gonna see if there's any new audience questions here. Comments. Okay, I'm just going to flip back over here. What do you consider to be potentially maybe top 3 most important factors in preparing for future invaders? Go ahead, Helen.
I can start. I mean, I think, you know, just from the horizon scanning that we did here in Britain, it was really important for us to make sure we then had effective surveillance and monitoring. And of course, you know, in an ideal world, we'd intercept before the species even kind of landed. But having that monitoring and surveillance and that early warning system is really important. But then having clear action plans in place for what's going to happen once that species arrives, and including within that sort of communication plans as to who needs to know what at which point to kind of affect that action. And again, I think the Asian hornet story in Britain has been a really excellent example, has been coordinated by the Non-Native Species Secretariat with our National Bee Unit and others. And it's complicated but it works really very well. So I think having the warning and then being prepared with a plan and knowing who's going to be involved with that plan is really important. But all the way through that, also communicating and sharing information to make sure that people are really aware. And, you know, people being lots of different people in lots of different organizations, it's really important.
Thanks, Helen. Anybody else want to add? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with Helen. You asked 3 most important factors in preparing for future invaders. So number 1, prevention. So like I mentioned before, invest in ecosystem and healthy ecosystems that are resistant and resilient. We also need to have a good handle on what the future invaders will be. You know, there's a recent paper on PNAS, predicting future invaders and future invasions, focused on, and this is by Frank Courchamp's group, and looking at ants, and in that looking at the traits of all the invasive ants that occur in the world. There and look, they were able to predict, okay, here are the next the 12 species you should be on the lookout for. So that's the prevention done in utilizing these new tools, not the way we've necessarily been doing them all along. We have now global databases that are that we can use towards that effect. So prevention. Number two, early detection. With early detection, we also have many new tools at our disposal. They're very interesting eDNA tools that we can use for early detection. But in addition, citizen science needs to be there as well. And third, rapid response, boots on the ground and active coordination to eradicate as soon as we can. And this is where what Helen was saying, having not so many stakeholders, but some, like the Invasive Species Center, is a great example of what is required. So centralize that and coordinate that rapid response.
Thanks, Pedro. Stephen, Tony, anything to add before we move on to the next one?
Well, I'm concerned about what we're not prepared for, and I don't think that scientists and managers are prepared to handle yet synergies between invasions and other anthropogenic stressors. There's a tendency, a traditional tendency that's changing, of studying one thing at a time, out of pragmatism. But we have overlapping stressors, obviously, in the form of climate change, landscape alteration, like urbanization, nutrient pollution, river impoundment, et cetera, et cetera. And we know already that multiple stressors have combined to create impacts. We know this because it took very careful experimentation and modeling to figure it out, which suggests that there are many other of these synergies that are occurring that we have overlooked or have not properly attributed to causes. One that comes to mind, because I'm an aquatic scientist, is the recurring avian botulism outbreaks in the Great Lakes over the last 20+ years. Hundreds of thousands of species, hundreds of thousands of birds, waterfowl, loons, mergansers, and gulls have washed up on the shores of Lake Erie, Lake Michigan, parts of Lake Huron, Lake Ontario, every year since 1999, having a neurotoxin that has basically caused them to drown, which is a perverse way for a waterfowl to die, but that's how they did it. We've realized that the best model to explain this is a connection between them and zebra and quagga mussels, where zebra and quagga mussels have altered conditions to create great oxygen demand, and I'm not going to get into details, which cause botulism bacteria spores, which are anaerobic, to thrive in the sediments in these dead zones that occur because of nutrient pollution and so on. And so, and warming have contributed to that too. And so they pass through the mussels to another invader, the round goby, and then to birds. And so this involved interaction between invaders, and involved interaction with climate change, nutrient pollution, and the mussels, and then you have the birds. So we have an impact that extends beyond the lakes to the birds, and you can imagine with the maggot cycle and so on, that will keep going into the insect world and so on. Now, we have models to understand how this works. We did a post-mortem. Post-mortems are post hoc explanations are not prediction. We couldn't have predicted this. We couldn't have predicted this from the European record because it wasn't recorded in Europe. So invasion history couldn't have been used. How many other times has something like this happened and we weren't sure what caused it? The question, the thing is, you can predict that such things will happen, even though you can't predict the exact ones or where, because we're having increasing overlapping stressors. So scientists have to find a way to better understand through risk assessment how to disentangle some of the major stressors. Managers have to find a way, guided by science and with sufficient political will, to be able to make a system less vulnerable to such things. So I'm sorry to say, there's no way getting around this. Root causes have to be addressed. We can't find band-aid solutions or techno fixes to this. That's one. The avian botulism example is one example. I can imagine other ones that connect to human health. In fact, I know of situations outside of Canada that connected to human health. So this is not just a luxury thing. This is biosecurity, right? And so we need a new way of thinking because of the new, because we are faced with a new challenge, and that new challenge is combined stressors because of overlap, because of the pervasiveness of all of these things interacting. It's like you could also have invaders interacting with each other. There's a whole concept called invasional meltdown about that. Now that's kind of alarming, because that means that as invasion rates increase, there's more chance that even things that are considered benign now to become problematic later in each other's presence, like having two benign chemicals mixed together to form a toxic mixture. In fact, we have examples of that too. We know that's happened. All right, so the sea lamprey, Stephen's favorite fish, paved the way because it removed the top predator, lake trout, for the alewife invasion. So there are lots of examples of it, many actually examples of that, and more that have occurred than have been studied. And I don't know, I can't offer you easy solutions to what I just described, but that's something that we're not prepared for.
Yeah, I'd like to just add to that. The thing is, I completely agree with this. We have a global change problem here. This global change problem for climate change, we have the IPCC developing scenarios and modeling and developing targets. So we have, and we have this deterministic processes and stochastic processes here at play. We have to get a very good handle on the deterministic processes, and we have to do that in light of all these different scenarios, and then deal with stochasticity based on resistance and resilience, as I mentioned before. But until we start treating invasive species with scenarios and targets, we can only get to this many more invaders, or what are the targets, until we are able to get there and take this seriously, because I think that's what Anthony was alluding to. We are not treating this seriously enough as we do with other global change factors. And these global change factors interact as well. So when we talk about climate change, we need to include invasive species. We think about microplastics. This has an impact also on, it's also a global change factor. So there's a lot here that really needs to be done, and we need targets. We don't have targets.
Helen, go ahead. Thanks, Pedro.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with, we need to be thinking about multiple drivers of biodiversity change and the complexity of the indirect drivers as well. And, I think often, of course, it would be great to have some kind of simple solution for every problem, but sometimes there isn't a simple solution. We have to really embrace the complexity of these systems and find our way through them. And I think, we know that climate change and invasive alien species are going to be two big drivers that interact alongside land and sea use change as well. But still, we have a tendency to work within our silos, if you like, and not to be thinking enough about what can we be learning from the other groups. And, for example, when we just think about the climate change, for instance, some of the solutions to climate change may actually exacerbate invasive alien species problems. So we need to all be talking about it as we move through to ensure that the solutions that we come up with are the best for people and the best for nature as well.
Definitely. Thank you guys for that great. Go ahead, Tony.
I don't want to leave people with the sense that this is all futile. There is something else we've learned. Here's a major insight, at least that's come to me for a little while, and like all major insights, somebody else has already thought of it, but I don't think the public appreciates it very well. And that is that we know, for example, that invaders can be, that are currently benign, can be triggered to become problematic. Some of them can, because of the overlapping stressors. That means that we're getting a kind of invasion debt, and I mean it from an impact point of view. An impact debt is, as we accumulate more invaders, even if most of them don't seem to do anything problematic, doesn't mean that they're going to remain that way. And so you have the kindling for a fire later. Okay, we know that. We know that there's a certain percentage, even if we assume it's a fixed percentage of species that are going to be very disruptive. And even if it's a small percentage, the more you add, the greater absolute number that translates to. Now, we know that invaders also interact with each other, and we know that they interact with other forms of other stressors. Knowing all this, one thing that I think people can appreciate when you think about it is that for every invader you add, you're increasing disproportionately the potential synergies or complicated effects, and some of them surprise effects they can have, which makes management very difficult since you never know when the next explosion is going to occur. With every invader you add, it follows also with every invader you keep out that you've stopped not just its impacts or its potential impacts, but every potential synergy it could have engaged in. All right, so you're reducing the impact debt. So that means that if we don't have to turn, and it's impossible to turn propagule pressure off completely, we don't have to make the invasion rate go to zero. It's nice to aim for that, but we'll never get there. But we don't have to, because what I just described means that we will benefit from just turning down the tap. And people have to realize this. It's not an exercise in futility. For as much as you can turn down that tap, you save yourself a lot of these hidden taxes I talked about, a lot of these surprises, a lot of the management disruptions or time bombs that could occur later. The thing is, like every successful, I think other people were alluding to this, with every successful security measure, you never know how much you've escaped, all right? But we do know we're escaping a lot of probable problems. And so keep in mind that we don't have to turn the tap down to zero or to close it completely. We just have to turn it down to get great benefits. And I believe from geopolitical point of view, the nation that best adapts to this onslaught of biosecurity threats by having public buy-in, for one thing, will have a very great socioeconomic advantage in the future. And so this is not just some environmental biodiversity conservation, among other things. It's not some environmental luxury. All right, we're talking about if you really want to get down to dollars and cents, all right, and socioeconomic disruption. I've just talked about these things as hidden time bombs. Some of them are bigger than others. I'm not alarmist because I can find plenty of cases to demonstrate to you that's the situation. So it follows that prevention in the sense of turning down the tap of the accumulation of established non-native species makes sense from empirical evidence, from case studies, from theoretical modeling. In all ways, it makes sense. So if we communicate to the public, not things that we can never achieve, not pie in the sky, but things that we can achieve, and if they accept that is gaining an advantage that they will never fully realize because they don't know what they missed, then we could go far into getting public support for the measures that are necessary to turn down the tap.
Great, thanks, Tony. Anybody have anything to add? Helen, I think I saw your hand.
Yeah, you did. And I think that, biosecurity is the big thing here, isn't it? It's, and as Tony said, the better we are at biosecurity, but there will be some things we will never know that we have prevented arriving and causing the next problem. And then that's been successful. But, people want measurements at times as to the sort of success of these things, and that's going to be tricky. But when we think about initiatives such as One Health and the way in which human health, animal health, plant health comes together, one of the things that when I mentioned this workshop where we brought people together to try and think about what might be the next pathogens on the horizon, it's really tricky, and it's because there are things that are falling between the gaps at the moment, such as, for example, wildlife diseases. We need to bring those all into that One Health biosecurity umbrella. And there's a recent paper out by Phil Hume on One Biosecurity. And I think this is the way in which we need to be thinking. We need to be thinking with our collaborate across with human health and animal health and plant health and learn these lessons such that we can implement the very best biosecurity that allows us to enjoy the trade that so many of us have got used to and the travel when we are able to, but ensuring that we're not bringing along species that are going to cause problems along the way or diseases that are going to cause problems along the way. It's possible.
Okay, thank you. I have one interesting question from the audience, and it's kind of relating to what we were just talking about on the biosecurity side of things. And they're wondering if you think that, or what your opinion is on all of the efforts that Canada and Ontario specifically are putting into invasive species work. Should we be working more closely with the United States or bordering states anyways, or I mean, I think we should be the bordering states anyways, but what are your opinions on that? If we're kind of putting in all this work and those bordering states aren't doing the same efforts, is there anything that we can do on that front? Go ahead, Stephen. Yeah.
Yeah, so to me, this is an obvious one, especially being that the invasion pathways aren't always linear. In other words, things come in through the side door, if you will. So I think that we need to be doing that certainly on a better scale here in Canada, so province to province, to territory and so on, but also with our American friends and others. So going back to that idea, you know, we need more and better surveillance and monitoring. That's not just on our doorstep. That's thinking about that globally and reaching out with allies who also have similar capacity to do that kind of work, so that we're prepared ahead of time before they're truly knocking on the door. So it's a lost opportunity when that kind of coordination doesn't happen, and it's even more shameful when that happens within a single nation like Canada, or when we've got a neighbor next door who we have such fantastic working relationship with in most days.
Thank you. Go ahead, Helen. Yeah.
Give a very quick perspective from Europe that, you know, it was so exciting when the EU regulation came into place, because it demonstrated how, as a set of countries, we could come together and work with one core aim around invasive alien species. Or actually, I mean, there's lots of aims within that regulation, but just tremendously exciting to see that coordinated action across borders. And that, yeah, definitely is incredibly important. And yeah, I think that regulation only came into place in 2015, but in terms of the collaborations that have come from it, it's been really, really amazing.
Thanks, Helen. Yeah, I always try to say when I'm doing my kind of education talks for my role, I always say that, you know, invasive species don't stop at our borders. You know, those are things that we made, and the species aren't gonna, they don't care, you know. So we should be working more as a whole and not as individual countries or provinces or whatnot. Thank you.
One thing that
yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to say one thing with specifically to the US and Mexico as well. I mean, there's the North American Invasive Species Network that was put together not about 10 years ago. And it serves, the aim of that was to be almost an analog of the CDC for invasive species. And so that all these different nodes, such as the Invasive Species Center and other agencies throughout the US and Mexico, are coordinated centrally. And I think that's extremely important, because we know there's a movement of invasive species along the latitudinal gradients, you know, a lot more flux from the south to the north, but that doesn't mean that it can happen vice versa. And so, yes, even though we border through air and water with pretty much the whole world, you know, the US definitely is such being also the biggest economy in the world. We absolutely need to be well connected with and coordinated with and create agencies such as the Invasive Species North American Invasive Species Network, and fund them, because they're not funded and taken seriously enough, given the clear picture that Tony you know, described, you know, that this is a serious problem. This is not something that it's a nice it's activism about protecting biodiversity. And so the institutions that we have are not funded to the same level. It's not equivalent to the dimension of the problem. There's a disconnect there.
Sure. Okay, thanks everyone. We have about 4 or 5 minutes left, so I might open the floor up to you guys. And is there anything that we didn't touch on today that you really want to talk about, really want to let the audience know, whether that can be advice to people working on the ground on invasive species management, any critical changes that should be made now or that we can try to make, anything under that umbrella? You can go ahead, Helen, start us off.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a plea for people to get involved with the reviewing process for the IPBES assessment on invasive alien species, because whether you're a policy person or you're involved with a local action group and community participation, you would be very welcome to register and take a look at those chapters of the assessment, which will be available later on in our summer, in the Northern Hemisphere summer. And I think that it just has sort of been resonating with me while I've been hearing everyone else talking about just that aspect of collaboration and that aspect of all working together as this global community. And I definitely think that the IPBES thematic assessment, bringing us together in that way, provides us with that possibility of working together. And you know, you don't have to read every bit of it. You could dip in and just read some sections that are specifically relevant to your own interest, and that would be really valuable in terms of the whole process.
Thanks for that, Helen. And if you want to send a link or anything over to me, I can distribute it to our registrants as well. Does anybody else have anything to add?
I think taking some of the ideas that have been talked about today, and in particular, I thought Tony made a really compelling case for, trying to convince the populace and the politicians about the value of, of keeping out every single, everyone we keep out is a win. So it's really about storytelling and coming up with that narrative in a way that resonates with the public and decision makers. And I think, that's not the wheelhouse or expertise of academics in most instances. And that's where we need really gifted storytellers to help. And I think that's in the comms sphere. I think that's what we need a lot more of. It's not necessarily something that we're going to get across with a press release after we publish the paper. No one frankly cares. What we need are stories, and have that embedded in curricula, in schools, and just so it becomes normalized and everybody gets it. And I think we've got a long ways to go there still.
Clearly, there is a communication problem, because we've known for decades of the link between environmental health and human health. And all that we've seen since then is burgeoning evidence to support that further. And involving invasive species, I can give you, and I won't, but I can give you countless cases where invasive species indirectly, for example, have effect in human health in serious ways. Give you one. Most recently, Burmese pythons in Florida being a center for all kinds of pet releases, and where the pet trade has been, and things escape, have got into the Everglades and have basically reduced mammalian diversity. Now, what is, because they're a predator that those species have never seen before, and that's always a signal that something disruptive could happen. They're novel. They are dealing with things that are naive to their effects, and so the species are being harmed by it. And as a result, there's been a really great reduction in parts of the Everglades where these pythons have concentrated. As a result of that, some species that were not abundant before are abundant now. So you have mosquitoes that may not be too picky about what mammals they're going to feed on, are now faced with a certain kind of rodent, which is more abundant. And so they're going to take blood meals from that rodent and transfer it to other mammals. Well, that rodent that is now abundant carries a virus that can transmit to humans and harm them. So because of the biodiversity loss, the reservoir that contained a problematic pathogen that otherwise was diluted because of all the other mammalian diversity that act as a buffer against that one being more assertive, is now the reservoir that is going to have the most opportunity to be transmitted by mosquitoes to humans. And so human health has just been changed by the Burmese python indirectly. And I can give you many examples of that happening around the world. So again, I come back to reduce the invasion rate and then escape all of these problems, many of them unforeseen or unforeseeable. Reduce the invasion rate. Treat this not as a problem of a mussel here or a plant there, but actually as symptomatic of a global change, a force of global change, in addition to other ones that we give attention to, like climate change. But this one can interact with all other forms of global change. This one deserves to be seen as a major phenomenon, an emergent phenomenon, not as isolated monster stories. For that, we need better communication.
Definitely. I agree, Tony, and thank you all so much. It looks like we've exhausted our hour here today. I want to thank each one of you for spending the time with me this morning. I think we had a great discussion and a lot of great points were brought up. On the theme of collaboration, which seems to be the theme of this forum thus far, for the attendees, there's a lot more presentations filling in through the next few days. Just to note for this afternoon, there is actually another panel discussion that's discussing the role of collaboration in the recent Asian longhorn beetle eradication. So if that's more you want to learn more about, check out that panel discussion this afternoon. And once again, thank you everyone, Stephen, Tony, Helen, and Pedro for joining me this morning. And I hope we'll get to work together again soon. Thank you so much.